The hum of an Epson projector fan is a very specific sound. It's a low, steady mechanical whir, the kind of white noise your brain usually filters out within seconds. But on that humid Sunday afternoon, July 4th, at exactly 3:15 p.m., it was the only sound in my living room. That and the soft, rhythmic sniffling coming from the center of the room. 40 relatives were packed into a space designed for maybe 20. The air conditioner was fighting a losing battle against the Georgia summer heat and the collective body heat of the Henderson family. You could smell the lingering scent of Uncle Henry's famous hickory-smoked barbecue brisket, mixed with the sharp tang of sweat and expensive floral perfumes. If you live long enough, you learn that family gatherings are really just theater with better food. But today, the performance was unparalleled. I stood motionless at the back of the room, my back pressed against the cool plaster of the hallway arch. In my right hand, I held the small, black plastic remote for the projector. In my left, I held nothing. I didn't need to. I already held all the cards. In the center of the living room, seated on the only tufted velvet armchair we owned, was my sister-in-law, Brenda. She was 42, though in that moment she looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. Around her torso, strapped tight over a pastel linen blouse, was a rigid gray aspen medical corset. She had both hands resting delicately on her knees, her posture stiff, her face tilted downward so the overhead fan caught the moisture on her cheeks. She was crying. Not the loud, ugly crying of true grief, but the quiet, brave tears of a martyr. The best liars don't demand your attention. They wait patiently for you to offer it. Slowly making its way through the rows of folding chairs and crowded sofa cushions was a large 1-gallon glass mason jar. It was the kind you usually see at rustic weddings filled with iced tea. But today it was wrapped in a wide band of burlap. Tied around the burlap with a piece of twine was a laminated card. In Brenda's looping, overly practiced calligraphy, the card read, "Brenda's medical relief." The goal was $10,000. That was the magic number she had quoted earlier over paper plates of potato salad. The exact out-of-pocket cost she claimed was necessary for a catastrophic, life-altering L4-L5 spinal fusion surgery. I watched the jar pass from hand to hand. I listened to the crinkle of paper money dropping into the glass. It sounded like an offering plate at a megachurch. $20 from Cousin Sarah. $50 from Aunt Diane, who was wiping her own eyes with a crumpled tissue. They were good people. That was the tragedy of it all. They were hardworking, honest people who believed that when a family member falls, you empty your pockets to help them stand back up. They didn't know they were funding a phantom. They didn't know that the woman weeping in the velvet armchair was about as injured as the decorative plastic flamingo staked in my front yard. There is a distinct kind of anger that doesn't burn hot. It burns freezing cold. It settles right behind your breastbone and slows your heartbeat down to a crawl. I looked over at my laptop, resting on a small folding TV tray next to the projector. Protruding from the left USB port was a tiny red and black 64GB SanDisk flash drive. To everyone else in the room, it was just the vessel for the annual Family Highlights slideshow, a harmless tradition of beach photos, graduation clips, and awkward Thanksgiving toasts set to instrumental music. They didn't know I had spent the last 3 nights sitting at my kitchen island, bathed in the blue light of Apple iMovie, meticulously editing the final 60 seconds of that presentation. Brenda let out a small, shuddering breath, pressing a hand to her lower back as if a sudden spasm had gripped her spine. A murmur of collective sympathy rippled through the room. My younger brother, standing dutifully by her side, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes bruised with the purple shadows of a man working double shifts to keep his drowning household afloat. When someone is busy digging their own grave, the most dangerous thing you can do is interrupt them. So I didn't. I didn't scream. I didn't point fingers. I didn't march to the center of the room and call her a fraud. Hysteria is a luxury I could never afford. Instead, I simply waited. I let the silence stretch. I let the jar make its final rounds. I waited until the trap was not just set, but perfectly, undeniably sprung. I watched Uncle Henry drop a crisp $100 bill into Brenda's jar, completely unaware that the next 60 seconds of video would cost her absolutely everything. My name is Eleanor. I am 58 years old, and for exactly 30 years and 4 months, I have walked the polished linoleum hallways of Westside High School as an administrative vice principal. I deal in facts, in permanent records, in truancy reports, and in mediating disputes between irate parents and exhausted teachers. My entire professional life has been dedicated to untangling the messy, complicated webs that people weave when they refuse to take responsibility for their own actions. The world runs on the sweat of people who simply do what is required of them, while the rest complain about the temperature. Because of my profession, I have developed a very finely tuned radar for deception. I know what an embellished story sounds like. I know the exact pitch a human voice hits when it is trying to sell you a convenient lie. More importantly, I know how to remain perfectly calm while someone is trying to sell it to me. But family is different. Family has a way of short-circuiting your logic and bypassing your common sense, especially when you are the designated caretaker. If you are the only one in the room holding an umbrella, everyone expects you to stand in the rain so they can stay dry. In the geographic center of my dining room sits a massive, heavy oak table. I refinished it by hand in the sweltering summer of 2018. I stripped the old varnish, sanded the wood down to its bare, honest grain, and meticulously sealed it with 4 coats of satin minwax polyurethane. That table is the literal and metaphorical center of the Henderson family. It is where Thanksgiving turkeys are carved, where taxes are organized, and inevitably, where people sit when they need to ask me for money. I am not a wealthy woman by any stretch of the imagination, but I am fiercely disciplined. And in a family prone to emotional theatrics and financial chaos, discipline looks an awful lot like wealth. Some people believe that tears can absolve them of the math they failed to do. I do not. 3 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday in October, my younger brother David and his wife Brenda sat at that very oak table. Brenda was 42 at the time, a woman who approached life as a series of personal slights directed exclusively at her. She was weeping into a paper napkin. Her business, a boutique dog bakery called Bark and Bite Confections, located in a gentrifying strip mall off Route 9, was 90 days away from total bankruptcy. She blamed the economy, the landlord, and the unrefined palates of local dog owners. She blamed everyone but her own decision to price organic peanut butter pupcakes at $9 apiece. David just looked gutted. His shoulders slumped under the weight of working double shifts at the logistics plant, just to keep the lights on. You don't hand over your life savings because you trust the business plan. You hand it over because you love the fool who co-signed the lease. So, I did what the bedrock of the family always does. I drove my 2015 Honda Accord to the State Employees Credit Union on Main Street. I sat in a gray cubicle with a loan officer named Margaret, signed my name 3 times in blue ink, and withdrew a $20,000 cashier's check directly from my hard-earned retirement account. But I didn't just hand it over blindly. I drew up a contract, a strict formalized repayment schedule, $500 a month due on the first of every month, no exceptions. Brenda signed it with a dramatic flourish, swearing up and down that I was their guardian angel. Gratitude has a remarkably short shelf life when it comes with a monthly invoice attached. For almost 3 years, the arrangement actually worked. The payments arrived. Sometimes they were 3 days late. Sometimes they were accompanied by a passive-aggressive text message from Brenda about how incredibly tight their margins were that quarter, but the money cleared the bank. Our relationship settled into a familiar, strained cordiality. I accepted that I would never be Brenda's favorite sister-in-law, that my unyielding practicality felt cold compared to her manufactured warmth. I accepted being the bank because it kept my brother's head above water. I truly thought we had an understanding. I thought there was a baseline of respect, a line even she wouldn't cross when it came to a woman who had handed over her security to keep the wolves from their door. I had always believed that blood was thicker than water, but I was about to learn that greed is the thickest substance of all. There were exactly 14 months left on the repayment schedule when the narrative suddenly shifted. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, 2 weeks before the next $500 check was due. When the phone rang, it was Brenda. She was sobbing so hysterically that I initially thought my brother had been killed in a car accident. But no. Through gasping breaths, she delivered the diagnosis, a catastrophic, inoperable L4-L5 ruptured disc. According to her, the doctor had said it was the worst spinal degradation he had seen in his career. One wrong twist, one heavy lift, and she could face permanent nerve damage. Because of this tragedy, she tearfully explained, she could no longer work her shifts at the bakery. Consequently, the loan payments to me had to be suspended indefinitely. I didn't hesitate. I told her to focus entirely on her health, that the money could wait. You can negotiate with a bank, but you cannot negotiate with a spine. Or so I thought. The dynamic of our family changed overnight. If Brenda's back was broken, it meant my back had to carry the slack. As the holidays approached, the heavy lifting of hosting fell entirely on my shoulders. Thanksgiving dinner for 25 people was hosted at my house, cooked in my kitchen, and funded by my wallet. I spent 14 hours straight on my feet. I remember the exact moment the resentment began to seed itself in my chest. I was hauling a 22-pound butterball turkey out of a 400-degree oven, the hot grease splattering against my forearms, my own knees aching from the relentless pace of the day. I glanced into the living room. Brenda was parked in the La-Z-Boy recliner, a plush heating pad draped over her shoulders. She was delicately sipping a glass of Pinot Noir while my brother David sat on the armrest, gently massaging her neck. She sighed loudly, telling everyone in the room how agonizing it was to just sit there and watch me do all the work. The loudest sigh in the room usually comes from the person doing the least amount of lifting. The physical toll on me was exhausting, but the financial toll on David was suffocating. The relief of pausing my $500 monthly check clearly wasn't enough. Brenda began leaving a paper trail of her manufactured suffering. A crumpling $150 copay receipt from a pain management specialist would be left casually on my dining table. There were constant, lingering hints about out-of-network deductibles and the exorbitant cost of holistic nerve therapies. I watched my brother hollow out before my eyes. His skin took on a gray, translucent quality. He started picking up graveyard shifts at the logistics plant, drinking lukewarm black coffee from a dented thermos just to keep his eyes open on the drive home. He was drowning, pulling double duty to fund a medical crisis that I was slowly beginning to realize only existed on paper. A lie doesn't just steal the truth. It steals the years and the vitality off the people who love you. I might have carried on being the dutiful blind soldier indefinitely if it weren't for a simple chicken divan. It was a random Thursday evening in late April. Knowing David was working yet another double shift, I decided to drive over unannounced and drop off a heavy glass casserole dish of dinner so he would have something hot to eat when he finally got home. I used my spare key and let myself in through the side door, stepping directly into their mudroom. The house was dead quiet. I set the heavy glass dish down on the lid of the washing machine. I turned to hang my raincoat, and that is when I saw it. Hanging on a brass coat hook partially obscured by winter jackets was Brenda's custom orthopedic back brace. It was a bulky, expensive piece of medical engineering, the exact one she claimed to wear under her clothes every time she left the house. I stepped closer. I didn't touch it. I just looked at it. It wasn't merely dusty. It was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of yellow spring pine pollen and fine gray household particulate. The Velcro straps were stiff and uncreased. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits quietly on a brass hook, waiting for you to turn on the lights. You do not abandon your structural support if your spine is dissolving. That brace hadn't been worn in months. I didn't gasp. I didn't call my brother. I simply picked up my empty hands, walked out the door, and quietly locked it behind me. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. A dusty back brace was enough to raise my eyebrows, but it was the Channel 8 morning news the next day that completely opened my eyes. I am, by nature and profession, an early riser. 5:30 a.m. is the only time the world isn't asking anything of me. It was the morning after my quiet discovery in the mudroom. I was sitting at my kitchen island, a cup of dark French roast cooling in my hands, with the television volume kept at a low, unintrusive hum. Some women fall apart when they find out the truth. I am not that woman. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and started observing. The Channel 8 Morning News was running a segment on the annual local Turkey Trot 5K charity run from the previous weekend. The anchor was cheerfully droning on about community spirit and record turnout. I wasn't really paying attention until the camera panned to the finish line, capturing the breathless, triumphant faces of the runners crossing the electronic timing mat. And there, cutting through the center of the frame, was my sister-in-law. She wasn't jogging. She was sprinting. Her face was flushed with exertion, her stride long and powerful. Pinned to the front of her expensive athletic top was a white paper square, bib number 4092. She crossed the finish line, threw her hands in the air in victory, and bent over at the waist to catch her breath. It was a fluid, deeply flexible motion that a woman with a degenerating L4-L5 spinal disc could not execute without screaming in agony. A lie is a full-time job, and eventually the liar always forgets to clock in. I didn't blink. I simply reached for the remote, rewound the live broadcast by exactly 45 seconds, and pressed the red record button on my DVR. I watched it 3 more times. I watched the confident strike of her running shoes against the asphalt. I watched the effortless, supple curvature of her spine. But a fleeting news clip can be argued away. A desperate liar will claim it was an old broadcast, or a trick of the camera, or a brief, miraculous moment of remission. I knew that if I was going to sever this parasite from my brother's life, I needed a Loctite case. I needed corroboration. At 10 a.m. that Saturday, I drove over to Brenda's neighborhood. I didn't park in her driveway. I parked 3 doors down and walked up the impeccably manicured brick pathway of her next-door neighbor, Martha. Martha is a 70-year-old retired corporate paralegal. She has sharp, intelligent eyes, a perfectly coiffed silver bob, and the distinct, unhurried demeanor of a woman who has spent 40 years documenting the costly mistakes of arrogant men. Martha also has a sweeping, unobstructed view of Brenda's backyard, fortified by a state-of-the-art Ring doorbell camera system mounted on her back patio. I brought Martha a tin of Danish butter cookies. We sat on her screened-in porch, sipping iced tea with lemon. I didn't have to explain much. Women like Martha do not need things spelled out. I simply asked if she had noticed anything unusual going on next door lately regarding Brenda's mobility. The people who think they are the smartest in the room always underestimate the quiet observation of the women they ignore. Martha smiled, a slow, knowing expression, and reached for her iPad. She opened the Ring application, scrolled back to the previous Tuesday afternoon, and handed the tablet to me across the wicker coffee table. The timestamp read 2:14 p.m. The footage was crystal clear. There was Brenda entirely alone on her back deck. She was wearing yoga pants and a tank top, no brace, no hesitation. She leaned over, gripped the bottom frame of a massive 60-pound solid teakwood patio sofa, and deadlifted it off the decking. With perfect, unbothered posture, she hauled the heavy piece of furniture 8 feet across the wood planks to reposition it into the afternoon sun. She didn't wince. She didn't pause. Martha graciously emailed me the video file before I even reached my car. I spent the next 3 quiet evenings sitting at my kitchen island. I am not a technology expert, but absolute necessity is a brilliant teacher. I opened Apple iMovie on my MacBook. I imported the gentle, nostalgic file of the annual Family Highlights slideshow. I let the acoustic guitar music swell over the photos of toddlers and beach trips, and then at the very end of the timeline, I made my surgical cuts. Vengeance is loud, sloppy, and rooted in emotion. Justice is quiet, meticulous, and requires no explanation. I seamlessly spliced the Ring camera footage of the teak wood sofa lift right after a beautiful photograph of my brother looking utterly exhausted. Then I added the Channel 8 broadcast of bib number 4092 crossing the finish line. No sound effects, no text on the screen, just the raw, undeniable visual data. Some people get mad. I prefer to get organized. If you appreciate a woman who lets the evidence do the talking, hit the like button. Now, let me tell you about the annual family reunion. I had the smoking gun securely in my pocket. All I needed now was the perfect stage, and Brenda was about to build it for me herself. Which brings us back to that sweltering July 4th afternoon, with the heavy, humid air pressing against the living room windows and the scent of hickory smoke hanging in the room. This was the moment Brenda had been building toward for 6 months. Faking an injury to get out of a $20,000 debt was a crime of avoidance, but what she was doing right now was a crime of active, predatory extortion. She wasn't just hiding from her obligations, she was weaponizing her fabricated pain to drain the pockets of the people who loved her husband. She had taken center stage in the velvet armchair, clearing her throat to command the room's attention. With a trembling voice, she delivered a practiced, tearful monologue about her degenerating L4-L5 disc. She told the room that the doctors had finally ordered a complex spinal fusion. She spoke of the grueling recovery ahead, the terrifying risks of paralysis, and, finally, the crushing out-of-pocket medical debts that insurance simply refused to cover. That was when she produced the burlap-wrapped mason jar and asked for a $10,000 sympathy fund. A thief who steals in the dead of night is at least honest about their intentions. A thief who cries while they rob you expects you to thank them for the privilege. I watched the jar circulate. I watched hard-earned money drop into the glass. I watched my brother David staring at the floor, hollowed out by a 6-month double-shift schedule that he believed was keeping his wife out of a wheelchair. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a flawless, sociopathic performance. When the jar finally made its way back to Brenda's lap, heavy with cash and checks, she dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue. She thanked everyone, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. The room settled into a heavy, somber silence. That was my cue. I stepped away from the hallway arch, my voice perfectly level, the pitch even and pleasant. I suggested that we lighten the mood and watch the annual family slideshow. People murmured in agreement, eager to shake off the heavy medical gloom. My brother turned off the overhead lights, plunging the room into the cool, blue glow of the projector. Nostalgia is a wonderful anesthetic right up until the cold truth wakes you up. I pressed play. For the first 3 minutes, the room was filled with the gentle acoustic strumming of generic background music. We watched pictures of Cousin Sarah's graduation. We watched a short video clip of a family trip to the Outer Banks. We watched Uncle Henry falling asleep in a lawn chair. The room laughed. The tension dissolved. Brenda was smiling, leaning back in her corset, secure in her victory, and then the acoustic music simply stopped. The screen went black for a fraction of a second. When the image returned, it was not a photograph. It was the time-stamped high-definition Ring camera footage from Martha's back porch. The room went instantly, paralyzingly still. The blue light washed over the 40 faces in the living room, reflecting in wide, unblinking eyes. On the massive screen, Brenda, wearing tight yoga pants and absolutely no medical brace, strutted confidently across her wood decking. She grabbed the frame of the 60-pound teakwood patio sofa. With the effortless grace of a competitive weightlifter, she hoisted it into the air and dragged it 8 feet across the frame. You can argue with a rumor, and you can gaslight a sibling, but you cannot cross-examine high-definition video. Nobody breathed. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the Epson projector fan. Brenda gripped the arms of the velvet chair, her knuckles turning bone white. She opened her mouth to speak, to formulate some desperate, impossible excuse, but my video editing was merciless. I didn't give her the time. Before a single word could leave her lips, the Ring footage cut sharply to the Channel 8 morning news broadcast. The bright, cheerful graphic of the Turkey Trot 5K filled the screen, and there was Brenda, bib number 4092, sprinting across the asphalt, her spine curving and flexing with the explosive power of a healthy, uninjured athlete, throwing her hands up as she crossed the finish line. I didn't say a single word. I didn't have to. I just let the 1080p resolution speak for me. In the front row, Uncle Henry simply stared at the screen. Slowly, as if his muscles had stopped taking commands from his brain, his knees parted. His paper plate tipped forward and a massive portion of barbecue brisket slid silently off his lap and landed with a wet thud on the living room rug. Beside him, David looked like a man who had just been shot in the chest, his eyes darting between the athletic marvel on the screen and the trembling, corseted fraud sitting in the armchair. Brenda looked at me, her face pale and her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, finally realizing that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's fully loaded. The projector light stayed on just long enough for the reality of the situation to burn itself permanently into the retinas of everyone present. Then I quietly reached over to the folding tray and pressed the circular power button on the remote. The hum of the Epson fan whirred down to a stop, plunging the living room back into the suffocating, mundane reality of a Sunday afternoon in July. Chaos is a perfectly predictable human reaction, but the clinical speed at which it overtook that living room was truly something to behold. Aunt Diane was the first to move. She didn't dream or demand an explanation. She simply stood up, walked deliberately to the center of the room, reached her hand into the burlap-wrapped mason jar sitting on Brenda's lap, and retrieved her $50 bill. She folded it twice, put it in her leather purse, and walked out the front door. The most humiliating walk of shame isn't leaving a party. It is sitting completely still while your own family calmly repossesses their pity. One by one, the relatives followed suit. There were no dramatic confrontations, just a silent, orderly procession of aunts, uncles, and cousins reclaiming their hard-earned money from the hands of a fraud. Uncle Henry didn't even bother cleaning up his ruined brisket. He just plucked his crisp $100 bill from the glass rim, shook his head in absolute disgust, and left. But it was my brother David who finally broke my heart. He didn't yell, he didn't cry. He looked at the woman he had been slowly killing himself for, the woman whose manufactured fragility had cost him his health, his sleep, and his dignity. He looked at the heavy medical corset strapped around her chest, and then he looked at the blank television screen. Without a single word, he turned around, walked out to his Ford F-150, and drove away. He filed for legal separation the following Tuesday, effectively closing the most exhausting chapter of his life. A liar can steal your money and waste your time, but they can never survive the moment you simply stop participating in their illusion. As for Brenda, she assumed the humiliation of that afternoon would be the end of it. She assumed I would write off the remainder of the business loan as the cost of excising her from our lives. She severely underestimated my affinity for paperwork. You cannot outrun a legally binding contract signed in blue ink at the state employees' credit union. On August 12th at exactly 9 a.m., I filed a civil suit in Fulton County Small Claims Court for the outstanding balance of $13,000. Brenda, ever the victim, didn't even bother to show up to the hearing. She assumed ignoring the summons would make it disappear, much like she assumed faking a spinal injury would make her debts evaporate. The presiding judge was not moved by her absence. He took one look at my meticulously organized binder of signed contracts and bank statements and immediately awarded me a default judgment. Sometimes the universe doesn't balance the scales for you. Sometimes you have to drive down to the courthouse and calibrate the weights yourself. Brenda's boutique dog bakery officially closed its doors in October. She recently found employment as an assistant manager at a Bath & Body Works out at the Perimeter Mall. I know this because, as of 3 weeks ago, 25% of her bi-weekly paycheck is legally garnished by the state. Every 1st and 15th of the month, a direct deposit is automatically transferred into my retirement account. It will take her a very long time to pay off $13,000 while selling cucumber melon body wash, but I am an exceptionally patient woman. Tonight, my house is perfectly quiet. It is 8 p.m., and a soft, steady evening rain is tapping gently against the glass of my kitchen window. I am standing at the same granite island where I spent 3 nights editing her downfall. In my hand is my favorite ceramic mug, filled to the brim with Hot Twinnings chamomile tea. The heavy burden of being the family's workhorse, the designated savior for people who refuse to save themselves, is entirely gone. My brother comes over for dinner on Sundays now, looking 10 years younger and finally sleeping through the night. I take a sip of my tea, listening to the rain, feeling a deep, unshakable peace settle over my home. You never have to raise your voice to someone who is busy digging their own grave. You just have to hand them a bigger shovel and wait. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.